taking the example of slavery, it should not be assumed that it is actually as easy to ban or get rid of slavery, at least as the Torah understands it, as we might think, right? Like growing up in America, you think in the context of American history. And in the context of American history, there was something very clearly called slavery, and a war was fought. And when it was over, slavery was no longer legal and it was over. And that, in that particular context, was a pretty undeniably good thing because of the nature of the institution of slavery that exists in America and all of that. But when you now look from the perspective of the Torah, you say, okay, well, question is, what does this word really mean? What kind of cases is it referring to? And there are those who will point out that the avdut, which might be translated as servitude or slavery, that might apply in one case where the Torah is talking about a particular case, the really practical scenario that is relevant to that kind of avdut is that someone, for example, stole and was a criminal and then couldn't pay back what he stole. And so he has to kind of work off the debt of what he stole. So is he a slave or is he being punished for a crime? And then once you start asking that question, you say, oh, well, we have prisons, right? That we put people in when they commit crimes like felony larceny or whatever. And sometimes people, when they're in prisons, do work details, so are they slaves or are they something else? And then you notice that actually the Torah doesn't provide for imprisonment at all. And when you look at incarceration as a practice, it's pretty awful. And you have to now ask yourself the question, well, if the Torah says, no, let's not provide for, the general practice of incarcerating people for years of their lives and trapping them as punishment for their crimes, and let's find other ways to kind of punish them for their crimes in a way that deters them, but also doesn't create some kind of institution of putting people in prison, which, by the way, in the narrative of the Torah is an Egyptian practice, right? Like Joseph goes to prison in Egypt. So it's not like people didn't have the idea of incarceration, but we encountered the idea of incarceration as the practice of our oppressors who enslaved us. And we don't have a lot of, let's say, when we learn mitzvot from the Torah, we don't have a lot of things where it's like, and if someone does this, then he gets 15 to 20 years, with parole after 10. That's not the way the Torah works with crime and punishment. And maybe there is a valuable lesson in that, but even if we don't want to sort of get into the details of that, we can say, well, the mere fact that there's that difference, and that difference is entangled with the fact that there's something called avdut, called servitude or slavery, that's associated essentially with punishing someone who isn't getting imprisoned but might have been imprisoned in another system for the same crime. Then we have to look very carefully before we start saying, oh, well, like, isn't it great to be in a society that doesn't have slavery today, of course, but it does have mass incarceration. And look at this other society, which is so horrible and backward, which had essentially the opportunity to work in servitude as payment for a crime of theft that you committed, but didn't have mass incarceration. It gets much murkier, right? So I think that, and that's like, you could go a whole other level and say, and for that matter, if you look at modern industrial societies and the nature of um, working in, let's say, in factories or other settings where people have decried at various points, especially early in the development, industrialization, and work conditions, et cetera, right? There may have been a technical sense in which the people working in factories in the late 19th century in England or North America weren't slaves, but the Torah isn't in a rush, I would say, to rule out the possibility that some of the laws that it uses to govern work and servitude are still relevant somehow for us to understand something about human economic organization, even though whatever is happening there is not being technically called slavery when it happens. So all of those are reasons, this is all kind of preface, right? But all of those are reasons to say we shouldn't be rushing to take things that are in the Torah and say, oh, we know we've moved past that, or we know that was for the Bronze Age, that was for 3,000 years ago, or we've transcended the basic facts of the human condition and we don't need that mitzvah anymore, or we're so smart and we're so enlightened, we know that we've gotten rid of this bad practice that the Torah allowed, and now we're blind to the fact that we may still have something that's the equivalent of it in our society, but that we call by another name, and then we don't have regulation of it in a godly way, the way the Torah is trying to provide, because it understands perhaps that it's not so easy to get rid of some form of servitude in a functioning society. And so it's better to be aware that it's there so that you can regulate it in a way that Hashem is going to use to teach us to treat each other better, rather than to pretend you don't have it and then do unbounded and unlimited things to each other in the space where you secretly do have it, right? So all of those are reasons that we don't want to be rushing to, do this kind of tactical retreat of the sort of Ben Shapiro sort that I mentioned before, and just say, oh yeah, we grew out of that, but it was very necessary, 3,000 years ago. It pointed towards the better result, and now people who keep the Torah completely agree with enlightened post-Christian British new atheist pseudo-intellectuals or whatever it is, right? So there's more subtlety to be found if we give the text its due for the substance of what it has to teach us about how to serve Hashem in a way that's relevant to our lives and the world that we inhabit, no matter when and no matter where we are.